1,000 Miles Up the Nile. Section 41. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 14. Carrasco to Abu Simbel. Part 2. The scene was a barren sandslope hemmed in between the town and cliffs and dotted over with graves. The actors were all women. Huddled together under a long wall some few hundred yards away, bareheaded and exposed to the blaze of the morning sun, they outnumbered the men by a full third. Some were sitting, some standing, while in their midst, pressing round a young woman who seemed to act as leader, there swayed and circled and shuffled a compact phalanx of dancers. Upon this young woman the eyes of all were turned. A black Cassandra, she rocked her body from side to side, clapped her hands above her head, and poured forth a wild declamatory chant, which the rest echoed. This chant seemed to be divided into strophes, at the end of each of which she paused, beat her breast, and broke into that terrible wail that we had heard just now from a distance. Her brother, it seemed, had died last night, and we were witnessing his funeral. The actual interment was over by the time we reached the spot, but 4 men were still busy filling the grave with sand, which they scraped up a bowlful at a time and stamped down with their naked feet. The deceased being unmarried, his sister led the choir of mourners. She was a tall, gaunt young woman of the plainest Nubian type, with high cheekbones, eyes slanting upwards at the corners, and an enormous mouth full of glittering teeth. On her head she wore a white cloth smeared with dust. Her companions were distinguished by a narrow white fillet, bound about the brow and tied with 2 long ends behind. They had hidden their necklaces and bracelets, and wore trailing robes and shawls, and loose trousers of black or blue calico. We stood for a long time watching their uncouth dance. None of the women seemed to notice us, but the men made way civilly and gravely, letting us pass to the front that we might get a better view of the ceremony. By and by an old woman rose slowly from the midst of those who were sitting, and moved with tottering, uncertain steps towards a higher point of ground, a little apart from the crowd. There was a movement of compassion among the men, one of whom turned to the rider and said gently, "His mother." She was a small, feeble old woman, very poorly clad. Her hands and arms were like the hands and arms of a mummy, and her withered black face looked ghastly under the mask of dust. For a few moments, swaying her body slowly to and fro, she watched the grave-diggers stamping down the sand, then stretched out her arms and broke into a torrent of lamentations. The dialect of Dare is strange and barbarous, but we felt as if we understood every word she uttered. Presently the tears began to make channels down her cheeks, her voice became choked with sobs, and falling down in a sort of helpless heap, like a broken-hearted dog, she lay with her face to the ground, and there stayed. Meanwhile, the sand being now filled in and mounded up, the men betook themselves to a place where the rock had given way, and selected a couple of big stones from the débris. These they placed at the head and foot of the grave, and all was done. Instantly, perhaps at an appointed signal, though we saw none given, the wailing ceased, the women rose, every tongue was loosened, and the whole became a moving, animated, noisy throng dispersing in a dozen different directions. We turned away with the rest, the writer and the painter rambling off in search of the temple, while the other 3 devoted themselves to the pursuit of baskets and native jewellery. When we looked back presently the crowd was gone, but the desolate mother still lay motionless in the dust. It chanced that we witnessed many funerals in Nubia, so many that one sometimes felt inclined to doubt whether the governor of Aswan had not reported over favourably of the health of the province. The ceremonial, with its dancing and chanting, was always much the same, always barbaric, and in the highest degree artificial. One would like to know how much of it is derived from purely African sources, and how much from ancient Egyptian tradition. The dance is most probably Ethiopian. Lepsius, travelling through the Sudan in A.D. 1843, saw something of the kind at a funeral in Wed Medina, about half-way between Sennar and Khartoum. The white fillet worn by the choir of mourners is, on the other hand, distinctly Egyptian. We afterwards saw it represented in paintings of funeral processions on the wall of several tombs at Thebes, where the wailing women are seen to be gathering up dust in their hands and casting it upon their heads, just as they do now. As for the wail, beginning high and descending through a scale divided not by semitones but thirds of tones, to a final note about an octave and a half lower than that from which it started, probably echoes to this day the very pitch and rhythm of the wail that followed the pharaohs to their sepulchres in the valley of the tombs of the kings. Like the zagharit, or joy cry, which every mother teaches to her little girls, and which, it is said, can only be acquired in very early youth, it has been handed down from generation to generation through an untold succession of ages. The song to which the fellah works his shadoof, and the monotonous chant of the sakia driver, have perhaps as remote an origin. But of all old, mournful human sounds, the death wail that we heard at Derr is perhaps one of the very oldest, certainly the most mournful. The temple here, dating from the reign of Rameses II, is of rude design and indifferent execution. Partly constructed, partly excavated, it is approached by a forecourt, the roof of which was supported by 8 square columns. Of these columns only the bases remain. 4 massive piers, against which once stood 4 colossi, upheld the roof of the portico and gave admission by 3 entrances to the rock-cut chambers beyond. That portico is now roofless. Nothing is left of the colossi but their feet. All is ruin, and ruin without beauty. Seen from within, however, the place is not without a kind of gloomy grandeur. 2 rows of square columns, 3 at each side, divide the large hall into a nave and 2 aisles. This hall is about 40 feet square, and the pillars have been left standing in the living rock, like those in the early tombs at Siout. The daylight, half blocked out by the fallen portico, is pleasantly subdued, and finds its way dimly to the sanctuary at the farther end. The sculptures of the interior, though much damaged, are less defaced than those of the outer court. Walls, pillars, doorways are covered with bas-reliefs. The king and Ptah, the king and Ra, the king and Amen, stand face to face, hand in hand, on each of the 4 sides of every column. Scenes of worship, of slaughter, of anointing, cover the walls, and the blank spaces are filled in as usual with hieroglyphic inscriptions. Among these Champollion discovered an imperfect list of the sons and daughters of Rameses II. 4 gods once sat enthroned at the upper end of the sanctuary, but they have shared the fate of the colossi outside, and only their feet remain. The wall sculptures of this dark little chamber are, however, better preserved, and better worth preservation, than those of the hall. A procession of priests, bearing on their shoulders the bari, or sacred boat, is quite unharmed, and even the colour is yet fresh upon a full-length figure of Hathor close by. But more interesting than all these, more interesting because more rare, is a sculptured palm tree against which the king leans while making an offering to Amun-Ra. The trunk is given with elaborate truthfulness, and the branches, though formalized, are correct and graceful in curvature. The tree is but an accessory. It may have been introduced with reference to the date harvests which are the wealth of the district, but it has no kind of sacred significance, and is noticeable only for the naturalness of the treatment. Such naturalness is unusual in the art of this period, when the conventional Persia and the equally conventional lotus are almost the only vegetable forms which appear on the walls of the temples. I can recall, indeed, but one similar instance in the bas-relief sculptures of the new empire, namely the bent, broken, and waving bulrushes in the great lion-hunting scene at Medinet Habu, which are admirably free and studied apparently from nature. Coming out, we looked in vain along the courtyard walls, for the battle scene in which Champollion was yet able to trace the famous fighting lion of Rameses II, with the legend describing him as the servant of his majesty rending his foes in pieces. But that was 45 years ago. Now it is with difficulty that one detects a few vague outlines of chariot wheels and horses. There are some rock-cut tombs in the face of the cliffs close by. The painter explored them, while the writer sketched the interior of the temple, but he reported of them as mere sepulchres, unpainted and unsculptured. The rocks, the sands, the sky, were at white heat when we again turned our faces toward the river. Where there had so lately been a great multitude, there was now not a soul. The palms nodded, the pigeons dozed, the mud town slept in the sun. Even the mother had gone from her place of weeping, and left her dead to the silence of the desert. We went and looked at his grave. The fresh-turned sand was only a little darker than the rest, and but for the trampled footmarks round about, we could scarcely have been able to distinguish the new mound from the old ones. All were alike nameless. Some more cared for than the rest were bordered with large stones and filled in with variegated pebbles. One or two were fenced about with a mud wall. All had a bowl of baked clay at the head. Wherever we saw a burial ground in Nubia, we saw these bowls upon the graves. The mourners, they told us, mourn here for 40 days, during which time they come every Friday and fill the bowl with fresh water, that the birds may drink from it. The bowls on the other graves were dry and full of sand, but the new bowl was brimming full, and the water in it was hot to the touch. We found El and the happy couple standing at bay with their backs against a big lebich tree, surrounded by an immense crowd and far from comfortable. Bent on bazaaring, they had probably shown themselves too ready to buy, so bringing the whole population, with all the mats, baskets, nose-rings, finger-rings, necklaces, and bracelets in the place about their ears. Seeing the straits they were in, we ran to the dahabeah and dispatched 3 or 4 sailors to the rescue, who brought them off in triumph. Even in Egypt it does not answer, as a rule, to go about on shore without an escort. The people are apt to be importunate, and can with difficulty be kept at a pleasant distance. But in Nubia, where the traveller's life was scarcely safe 50 years ago, unprotected Inglesi are pretty certain to be disagreeably mobbed. The natives, in truth, are still mere savages au fond, the old war paint being but half disguised under a thin veneer of Mohammedism. Some of the women who followed our friends to the boat, though in complexion as black as the rest, had light blue eyes and frizzy red hair, the effect of which was indescribably frightful. Both here and at Ibrim there are many of these fair families, who claim to be descended from Bosnian fathers stationed in Nubia at the time of the conquest of Sultan Selim in A.D. 1517. They are immensely proud of their alien blood, and think themselves quite beautiful. End of section 41. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 42. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 14. Korosko to Abu Simbel, Part 3. All hands being safe on board, we pushed off at once, leaving about a couple of hundred disconsolate dealers on the bank. A long-drawn howl of disappointment followed in our wake. Those who had sold and those who had not sold were alike wronged, ruined, and betrayed. One woman tore wildly along the bank, shrieking and beating her chest. Foremost among the sellers, she had parted from her gold brow pendant for a good price, but was inconsolable now for the loss of it. It often happened that those who had been most eager to trade were readiest to repent of their bargains. Even so, however, their cupidity outweighed their love of finery. Moved once or twice by the lamentations of some dark damsel who had sold her necklace at a handsome profit, we offered to annul the purchase. But it invariably proved that, despite her tears, she preferred to keep the money. The palms of Deir and of the rich desert beyond were the finest we saw throughout the journey. Straight and strong and magnificently plumed, they rose to an average height of 70 or 80 feet. These superb plantations supply all Egypt with saplings, and contribute a heavy tax to the revenue. The fruit, sun-dried and shriveled, is also sent northwards in large quantities. The trees are cultivated with strenuous industry by the natives, and owe as much of their perfection to laborious irrigation as to climate. The foot of each separate palm is surrounded by a circular trench into which the water is conducted by a small channel about 14 inches in width. Every palm grove stands in a network of these artificial runlets. The reservoir from which they are supplied is filled by means of a sakia, or water wheel, a primitive and picturesque machine consisting of two wheels, the one set vertically to the river and slung with a chain of pots, the other a horizontal cog turned sometimes by a camel, but more frequently in Nubia by a buffalo. The pots, which go down empty, dip under the water and come up full, feed a sloping trough which in some places supplies a reservoir, and in others communicates at once with the irrigating channels. These sakias are kept perpetually going, and are set so close just above Dare that the writer counted a line of 15 within the space of a single mile. There were probably quite as many on the opposite bank. The sakias creak atrociously, and their creaking ranges over an unlimited gamut. From morn till dewy eve, from dewy eve till morn, they squeak, they squeal, they grind, they groan, they creak. Heard after dark, sakia answering to sakia, their melancholy chorus makes night hideous. To sleep through it is impossible. Being obliged to moor a few miles beyond Dare, and having lain awake half the night, we offered a sakia driver a couple of dollars if he would let his wheel rest till morning. But time and water are more precious than even dollars at this season, and the man refused. All we could do, therefore, was to punt into the middle of the river, and lie off at a point as nearly possible equidistant from our two nearest enemies. The native dearly loves the tree which costs him so much labour, and thinks it the chef d'oeuvre of creation. When Allah made the first man, says an Arab legend, he found he had a little clay to spare, so with that he made the palm. And to the poor Nubian, at all events, the gifts of the palm are almost divine, supplying food for his children, thatch for his hovel, timber for his water wheel, ropes, matting, cups, bowls, and even the strong drink forbidden by the Prophet. The date wine is yellowish white, like whiskey. It is not a wine, however, but a spirit, coarse, fiery, and unpalatable. Certain trees, as for instance the perky little pine of the German wald, are apt to become monotonous, but one never wearies of the palm. Whether taken singly or in masses, it is always graceful, always suggestive. To the sketcher on the Nile it is simply invaluable. It breaks the long parallels of river and bank, and composes with the stern lines of Egyptian architecture as no other tree in the world could do. Subjects, indeed! Said once upon a time an eminent artist to the present writer. Fiddlesticks about subjects! Your true painter can make a picture out of a post and a puddle. Substitute a palm, however, for a post, combine it with anything that comes first, a camel, a shadoof, a woman with a water jar upon her head, and your picture stands before you ready made. Nothing more surprised me at first than the colour of the palm frond, which painters of Eastern landscapes are wont to depict of a hard bluish tint, like the colour of a yucca leaf. Its true shade is a tender, bloomy, sea-green grey, difficult enough to match, but in most exquisite harmony with the glow of the sky and the gold of the desert. The palm groves kept us company for many a mile, backed on the Arabian side by long level ranges of sandstone cliffs horizontally stratified, like those of the Thebaid. We now scarcely ever saw a village, only palms and sakias and sandbanks in the river. The villages were there but invisible, being built on the verge of the desert. Arable land is too valuable in Nubia for either the living to dwell upon it or the dead to be buried in it. At Ibrim, a sort of ruined Ehrenbreitstein on the top of a grand precipice overhanging the river, we touched for only a few minutes, in order to buy a very small shaggy sheep which had been brought down to the landing place for sale. But for the breeze that happened just then to be blowing, we should have liked to climb the rock, and see the view in the ruins, which are part modern, part Turkish, part Roman, and little, if at all, Egyptian. There are also some sculptured and painted grottoes to be seen in the southern face of the mountain. They are, however, too difficult of access to be attempted by ladies. Alfred, who went ashore after quail, was drawn up to them by ropes, but found them so much defaced as to be scarcely worth the trouble of a visit. We were now only 34 miles from Abu Simbel, but making slow progress, and impatiently counting every foot of the way. The heat at times was great, frequent and fitful spells of Khamsun wind alternating with a hot calm that tried the trackers sorely. Still we pushed forward a few miles at a time, till by and by the flat-topped cliffs dropped out of sight and were again succeeded by volcanic peaks, some of which looked loftier than any of those about Dacca or Korosko. Then the palms ceased, and the belt of cultivated land narrowed to a thread of green between the rocks and the water's edge. And at last there came an evening when we only wanted breeze enough to double 2 or 3 more bends in the river. "Is it to be Abu Simbel to-night?" we asked for the 20th time before going down to dinner. To which Rais Hassan replied, "Aywa," certainly, but the pilot shook his head and added, "Bukra," tomorrow. When we came up again the moon had risen but the breeze had dropped. Still we moved, impelled by a breath so faint that one could scarcely feel it. Presently even this failed. The sail collapsed, the pilot steered for the bank, the captain gave the word to go aloft, when a sudden puff from the north changed our fortunes, and sent us out again with a well-filled sail into the middle of the river. None of us, I think, will be likely to forget the sustained excitement of the next 3 hours. A light more mysterious and unreal than the light of day filled and overflowed the wide expanse of river and desert. We could see the mountains of Abu Simbel standing as it seemed across our path in the far distance, a lower one first, then a larger, then a series of receding heights all close together yet all distinctly separate. That large one, the mountain of the great temple, held us like a spell. For a long time it looked a mere mountain like the rest. By and by, however, we fancied we detected a something, a shadow, such a shadow as might be cast by a gigantic buttress. Next appeared a black speck no bigger than a porthole. We knew that this black speck must be the doorway. We knew that the great statues were there, though not yet visible, and that we must soon see them. For our sailors, meanwhile, there was an excitement of a chase. The Bagstones and 3 other dahabiyehs were coming up behind us in the path of the moonlight. Their galley fires glowed like beacons on the water, the nearest about a mile away, the last a spark in the distance. We were not in the mood to care much for racing to-night, but we were anxious to keep our lead and be first at the mooring place. To run upon a sandbank at such a moment was like being plunged suddenly into cold water. Our sail flapped furiously. The men rushed to the punting poles. 4 jumped overboard and shoved with all the might of their shoulders. By the time we got off, however, the other boats had crept up half a mile nearer, and we had hard work to keep them from pressing closer on our heels. At length the last corner was rounded, and the great temple stood straight before us. The facade, sunk in the mountain side like a huge picture in a mighty frame, was now quite plain to see. The black speck was no longer a porthole, but a lofty doorway. Last of all, though it was night and they were still not much less than a mile away, the 4 colossi came out, ghost-like, vague and shadowy in the enchanted moonlight. Even as we watched them they seemed to grow, to dilate, to be moving towards us out of the silvery distance. It was drawing on towards midnight when the Philae at length ran in close under the great temple. Content with what they had seen from the river, the rest of the party then went soberly to bed, but the painter and the writer had no patience to wait till morning. Almost before the mooring rope could be made fast, they had jumped ashore and begun climbing the bank. They went and stood at the feet of the colossi, and on the threshold of that vast portal beyond which was darkness. The great statues towered above their heads. The river glittered like steel in the far distance. There was a keen silence in the air, and towards the east the Southern Cross was rising. To the strangers who stood talking there with bated breath, the time, the place, even the sound of their own voices seemed unreal. They felt as if the whole scene must fade with the moonlight, and vanish before morning. End of section 42. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 43. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 15. Rameses the Great, Part 1. The central figure of Egyptian history has always been, probably always will be, Rameses II. He holds this place partly by right, partly by accident. He was born to greatness, he achieved greatness, and he had borrowed greatness thrust upon him. It was his singular destiny not only to be made a posthumous usurper of glory, but to be forgotten by his own name and remembered in a variety of aliases. As Sesosis, as Ozymandias, as Sesostris, he became credited in course of time with all the deeds of all the heroes of the new empire, beginning with Thutmose III, who preceded him by 300 years, and ending with Sheshonq, the captor of Jerusalem, who lived 4 centuries after him. Modern science, however, has repaired this injustice, and while disclosing the long-lost names of a brilliant succession of sovereigns, has enabled us to ascribe to each the honours which are his due. We know now that some of these were greater conquerors than Rameses II. We suspect that some were better rulers. Yet the popular hero keeps his ground. What he has lost by interpretation on the one hand, he has gained by interpretation on the other, and the Beau Sabreur of the 3rd Salur Papyrus remains to this day the representative pharaoh of a line of monarchs whose history covers a space of 50 centuries, and whose frontiers reached at one time from Mesopotamia to the ends of the Sudan. The interest that one takes in Rameses II begins at Memphis, and goes on increasing all the way up the river. It is a purely living, a purely personal interest, such as one feels in Athens for Pericles, or in Florence for Lorenzo the Magnificent. Other pharaohs but languidly affect the imagination. Thutmose and Amenhotep are to us as Darius or Artaxerxes, shadows that come and go in the distance. But with the second Rameses we are on terms of respectful intimacy. We seem to know the man, to feel his presence, to hear his name in the air. His features are as familiar to us as those of Henry VIII or Louis XIV. His cartouches meet us at every turn. Even to those who do not read the hieroglyphic character, those well-known signs convey, by sheer force of association, the name and style of Rameses, beloved of Amen. This being so, the traveller is ill-equipped who goes through Egypt without something more than a mere guide-book knowledge of Rameses II. He is, as it were, content to read the argument and miss the poem. In the desolation of Memphis, in the shattered splendour of Thebes, he sees only the ordinary pathos of ordinary ruins. As for Abu Simbel, the most stupendous historical record ever transmitted from the past to the present, it tells him a but half-intelligible story. Holding to the merest thread of explanation, he wanders from hall to hall, lacking altogether that potent charm of foregone association which no Murray can furnish. Your average Frenchman straying helplessly through Westminster Abbey under the conduct of the verger has about as vague a conception of the historical importance of the things he sees. What is true of the traveller is equally true of those who take their vial vicariously in connection with Mudie. If they are to understand any description of Abu Simbel, they must first know something about Rameses II. Let us then, while the Philae lies moored in the shadow of the rock of Abshek, review, as summarily as may be, the leading facts of this important reign. Such facts, that is to say, as are recorded in inscriptions, papyri, and other contemporary monuments. Rameses II was the son of Seti I, the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, and of a certain Princess Tua, described on the monuments as royal wife, royal mother, and heiress and sharer of the throne. She is supposed to have been of the ancient royal line of the preceding dynasty, and so to have had, perhaps, a better right than her husband to the double crown of Egypt. Through her, at all events, Rameses II seems to have been in some sense born a king, equal in rank, if not in power, with his father. His rights, moreover, were fully recognized by Seti, who accorded him royal and divine honours from the hour of his birth, or, in the language of the Egyptian historians, while he was yet in the egg. The great dedicatory inscription of the temple of Osiris at Abydos relates how his father took the royal child in his arms, when he was yet little more than an infant, showed him to the people as their king, and caused him to be invested by the great officers of the palace with the double crown of the two lands. The same inscription states that he was a general from his birth, and that as a nursling he commanded the bodyguard and the brigade of chariot fighters. But these titles must of course have been purely honorary. At 12 years of age he was formally associated with his father upon the throne, and by the gradual retirement of Seti I from the cares of active government, the co-royalty of Rameses became, in the course of the next 10 or 15 years, an undivided responsibility. He was probably about 30 when his father died, and it is from this time that the years of his reign are dated. In other words, Rameses II, in his official records, counts only from the period of his sole reign, and the year of the death of Seti is the year 1 of the monumental inscriptions of his son and successor. In the 2nd, 4th, and 5th years of his monarchy, he personally conducted campaigns in Syria, more than one of the victories then achieved being commemorated on the rock-cut tablets of Nahr el-Keb near Beirut, and that he was by this time recognized as a mighty warrior is shown by the stela of Dacca, which dates from the 3rd year and celebrates him as terrible in battle, the bull powerful against Ethiopia, the griffin furious against the negroes, whose grip has put the mountaineers to flight. The events of his second campaign, undertaken 2 years later in order to reduce to obedience the revolted tribes of Syria and Mesopotamia, are immortalized in the poem of Pentar. It was on this occasion that he fought his famous single-handed fight, against overwhelming odds, in the sight of both armies under the walls of Kadesh. 3 years later he carried fire and sword into the land of Canaan, and in his 11th year, according to inscriptions yet extant upon the ruined pylons of the Ramesseum at Thebes, he took, among other strong places on sea and shore, the fortresses of Ascalon and Jerusalem. The next important record transports us to the 21st year of his reign. 10 years have now gone by since the fall of Jerusalem, during which time a fluctuating frontier warfare has probably been carried on, to the exhaustion of both armies. Khedisira, Prince of Kheda, sues for peace. An elaborate treaty is thereupon framed, whereby the said prince and Rameses, chief of rulers who fixes his frontiers where he pleases, pledge themselves to a strict offensive and defensive alliance, and to the maintenance of good will and brotherhood forever. The treaty, we are told, was engraved for the Khitan prince upon a tablet of silver adorned with the likeness of the figure of Sutekh, the great ruler of heaven, while for Rameses Mer Amen it was graven on a wall adjoining the great hall at Karnak, where it remains to this day. According to the last clause of this curious document, the contracting parties enter also into an agreement to deliver up to each other the political fugitives of both countries, providing at the same time for the personal safety of the offenders. Whosoever shall be so delivered up, says the treaty, himself, his wives, his children, let him not be smitten to death, moreover, let him not suffer in his eyes, in his mouth, in his feet, moreover, let not any crime be set up against him. This is the earliest instance of an extradition treaty upon record, and it is chiefly remarkable as an illustration of the clemency with which international law was at that time administered. Finally, the convention between the sovereigns is placed under the joint protection of the gods of both countries. Sutekh of Kheda, Amen of Egypt, and all the 1,000 gods, the gods male and female, the gods of the hills, of the rivers, of the great sea, of the winds and the clouds, of the land of Kheda, and of the land of Egypt. The peace now concluded would seem to have remained unbroken throughout the rest of the long reign of Rameses II. We hear at all events of no more wars, and we find the king married presently to a Khitan princess, who in deference to the gods of her adopted country takes the official name of Ma'at-iri Neferu Ra, or contemplating the beauties of Ra. The names of 2 other queens, Nefertari and Astenefert, are also found upon the monuments. These 3 were probably the only legitimate wives of Rameses II, though he must also have been the lord of an extensive harem. His family, at all events, as recorded upon the walls of the temple of Wadi Suba, amounted to no less than 170 children, of whom 111 were princes. This may have been a small family for a great king 3,000 years ago. It was but the other day, comparatively speaking, that Lepsius saw and talked with old Hassan, Kashif of Dare, the same petty ruler who gave so much trouble to Belzoni, Burckhardt, and other early travellers; and he, like a patriarch of old, had in his day been the husband of 64 wives and the father of something like 200 children. For 46 years after the making of the Denton Treaty, Rameses the Great lived at peace with his neighbours and tributaries. The evening of his life was long and splendid. It became his passion and his pride to found new cities, to raise dikes, to dig canals, to build fortresses, to multiply statues, obelisks, and inscriptions, and to erect the most gorgeous and costly temples in which man ever worshipped. To the monuments founded by his predecessors he made additions so magnificent that they dwarfed the designs they were intended to complete. He caused artesian wells to be pierced in the stony bed of the desert. He carried on the canal begun by his father, and opened the waterway between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. No enterprise was too difficult, no project too vast, for his ambition. As a child, says the Stella of Dhaka, he superintended the public works, and his hands laid their foundations. As a man he became the supreme builder. Of his gigantic structures only certain colossal fragments have survived the ravages of time, yet those fragments are the wonder of the world. End of section 43. Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 44. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 15. Rameses the Great, Part 2. To estimate the cost at which these things were done is now impossible. Every temple, every palace represented a hectacomb of human lives. Slaves from Ethiopia, captives taken in war, Syrian immigrants settled in the Delta were alike pressed into the service of the state. We know how the Hebrews suffered, and to what an extremity of despair they were reduced by the tasks imposed upon them. Yet even the Hebrews were less cruelly used than some who were kidnapped beyond the frontiers. Torn from their homes without hope of return, driven in herds to the mines, the quarries, and the brick-fields, these hapless victims were so dealt with that not even the chance of desertion were open to them. The Negroes from the south were systematically drafted to the north, the Asiatic captives were transported to Ethiopia. Those who laboured underground were goaded on without rest or respite, till they fell down in the mines and died. That Rameses II was the Pharaoh of the Captivity, and that Meneptah, his son and successor, was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, are now among the accepted presumptions of Egyptological science. The Bible and the monuments confirm each other upon these points, while both are again corroborated by the results of recent geographical and philological research. The treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses, which the Israelites built for Pharaoh with bricks of their own making, are the Patum and Pa-Rameses of the inscriptions, and both have recently been identified by M. Nile in the course of his excavations conducted in 1883 and 1886 for the Egypt Exploration Fund. The discovery of Pithom, the ancient biblical treasure city of the first chapter of Exodus, has probably attracted more public attention and been more widely discussed by European savants than any archaeological event since the discovery of Nineveh. It was in February 1883 that M. Nile opened the well-known mound of Tel el Maskuta on the south bank of the new Sweetwater Canal in the Wadi Tumilat, and there discovered the foundations and other remains of a fortified city of the kind known in Egyptian as Bekhen or Storefort. This Bekhen, which was surrounded by a wall 30 feet in thickness, proved to be about 12 acres in extent. In one corner of the enclosure were found the ruins of a temple built by Rameses II. The rest of the area consisted of a labyrinth of subterraneous rectangular cellars or store chambers, constructed of sun-dried bricks of large size and divided by walls varying from 8 to 10 feet in thickness. In the ruins of the temple were discovered several statues more or less broken, a colossal hawk inscribed with the royal ovals of Rameses II, and other works of art dating from the reigns of Osorkon II, Nectanebo, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. The hieroglyphic legends engraved upon the statues establish the true value of the discovery by giving both the name of the city and the name of the district in which the city was situate, the first being Patum, Pithom, the abode of Tum, and the second being Thukut, Sukkoth, so identifying Pathum in the district of Thukut with Pithom, the treasure city built by the forced labor of the Hebrews, and Sukkoth, the region in which they made their first halt on going forth from the land of bondage. Even the bricks with which the great wall and the walls of the store chambers are built bear eloquent testimony to the toil of the suffering colonists, and confirm in its minutest details the record of their oppression, some being duly kneaded with straw, others, when the straw was no longer forthcoming, being mixed with the leafage of a reed common to the marshlands of the delta, and the remainder, when even this substitute ran short, being literally bricks without straw, moulded of mere clay crudely dried in the sun. The researches of M. Naville further showed that the temple to Tum, founded by Rameses II, was restored or rebuilt by Osorkon II of the 22nd dynasty, whilst at a still higher level were discovered the remains of a Roman fortress. That Pithom was still an important place in the time of the Ptolemies is proved by a large and historically important tablet found by M. Naville in one of the store chambers, where it had been thrown in with other sculptures and rubbish of various kinds. This table records repairs done to the canal, an expedition to Ethiopia, and the foundation of the city of Arsinoe. Not less important from a geographical point of view was the finding of a Roman milestone which identifies Pithom with Hieropolis, where, according to the Septuagint, Joseph went forth to meet Jacob. This milestone gives 9 Roman miles as the distance from Hieropolis to Clysma. A very curious manuscript lately discovered by Signore Gammarini in the library of Arezzo shows that even so late as the 4th century of the Christian era, this ancient walled enclosure, the camp or aerocastra of the Roman period, the Pithom of the Bible, was still known to pious pilgrims as the Pithom built by the children of Israel, that the adjoining town external to the camp, at that time established within the old Pithom boundaries, was known as Hieropolis, and that the town of Rameses was distant from Pithom about 20 Roman miles. As regards Pa-Rameses, the other treasure city of Exodus, it is conjecturally but not positively identified by M. Naville with the mound of Saft el-Henna, the scene of his explorations in 1886. That Saft el-Henna was identical with Kes, or Goshen, the capital of the land of Goshen, has been unequivocally demonstrated by the discoverer, and that it was also known in the time of Rameses II as Pa-Rameses is shown to be highly probable. There are remains of a temple built of black basalt, with pillars, fragments of statues, and the like, all inscribed with the cartouches of Rameses II, and the distance from Pithom is just 20 Roman miles. It was from Pa-Rameses that Rameses II set out with his army to attack the confederate princes of Asia Minor, then lying in ambush near Kadesh, and it was thither that he returned in triumph after the great victory. A contemporary letter, written by one Panbiza, a scribe, narrates in glowing terms the beauty and abundance of the royal city, and tells how the damsels stood at their doors in holiday apparel, with nosegays in their hands and sweet oil upon their locks, on the day of the arrival of the war god of the world. This letter is in the British Museum. Other letters written during the reign of Rameses II have by some been supposed to make direct mention of the Israelites. "I have obeyed the orders of my master," writes the scribe Kauser to his superior Bakim Ta, "being bidden to serve out the rations to the soldiers, and also to the Aperiu Hebrews, who quarry stone for the palace of King Rameses Mer Amen." A similar document written by a scribe named Keniamun, and couched in almost the same words, shows these Aperiu on another occasion to have been quarrying for a building on the southern side of Memphis, in which case Tura would be the scene of their labours. These invaluable letters, written on papyrus in the hieratic character, are in good preservation. They were found in the ruins of Memphis, and now form a part of the treasures of the Museum of Leyden. They bring home to us with startling nearness the events and actors of the Bible narrative. We see the toilers at their task, and the overseers reporting them to the directors of public works. They extract from the quarry those huge blocks which are our wonder to this day. Harnessed to rude sledges, they drag them to the riverside and embark them for transport to the opposite bank. Some are so large and heavy that it takes a month to get them down from the mountains to the landing place. Other laborers are elsewhere making bricks, digging canals, helping to build the great wall which reached from Pelusium to Heliopolis, and strengthening the defences not only of Pithom and Rameses, but of all the cities and forts between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. Their lot is hard, but not harder than the lot of other workmen. They are well fed, they intermarry, they increase and multiply. The season of their great oppression is not yet come. They make bricks, it is true, and those who are so employed must supply a certain number daily. But the straw is not yet withheld, and the task, though perhaps excessive, is not impossible. For we are here in the reign of Rameses II, and the time when Meneptah shall succeed him is yet far distant. It is not till the king dies that the children of Israel sigh by reason of the bondage. There are in the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Bibliothèque Nationale some much older papyri than those 2 letters of the Leyden collection, some as old, indeed, as the time of Joseph, but none perhaps of such peculiar interest. In these the scribes Chaucer and Kenyamun seem still to live and speak. What would we not give for a few more of their letters? These men knew Memphis in its glory, and had looked upon the face of Rameses the Great. They might even have seen Moses in his youth, while yet he lived under the protection of his adopted mother, a prince among princes. Chaucer and Kenyamun lived and died and were mummied between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, yet these frail fragments of papyrus have survived the wreck of ages, and the quaint writing with which they are covered is intelligible to ourselves as to the functionaries to whom it was addressed. The Egyptians were eminently businesslike, and kept accurate entries of the keep and labour of their workmen and captives. From the earliest epoch of which the monuments furnish record, we find an elaborate bureaucratic system in full operation throughout the country. Even in the time of the pyramid builders there are ministers of public works, inspectors of lands, lakes, and quarries, secretaries, clerks, and overseers innumerable. From all these we may be sure were required strict accounts of their expenditure, as well as reports of the work done under their supervision. Specimens of Egyptian bookkeeping are by no means rare. The Louvre is rich in memoranda of the kind, some relating to the date tax, others to the transport and taxation of corn, the payment of wages, the sale and purchase of land for burial, and the like. If any definite and quite unmistakable news of the Hebrews should ever reach us from Egyptian sources, it will almost certainly be through the medium of documents such as these. End of section 44. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 45. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 15. Rameses the Great, Part 3. An unusually long reign, the 46 years of which would seem to have been spent in peace and outward prosperity, enabled Rameses II to indulge his ruling passion without interruption. To draw up anything like an exhaustive catalogue of his known architectural works would be equivalent to writing an itinerary of Egypt and Ethiopia under the 19th dynasty. His designs were as vast as his means appeared to have been unlimited. From the Delta to Gebel Barkal, he filled the land with monuments dedicated to his own glory and to the worship of the gods. Upon Thebes, Abydos, and Tanis, he lavished structures of surpassing magnificence. In Nubia, at the places now known as Gerf Hassain, Wadi Subua, Der, and Abu Simbel, he was the author of temples and the founder of cities. These cities, which would probably be better described as provincial towns, have disappeared, and but for the mention of them in various inscriptions we should not even know that they had existed. Who shall say how many more have vanished, leaving neither trace nor record? A dozen cities of Rameses may yet lie buried under some of those nameless mounds which follow each other in such quick succession along the banks of the Nile in Middle and Lower Egypt. Only yesterday, as it were, the remains of what would seem to have been a magnificent structure decorated in a style absolutely unique were accidentally discovered under the mounds of Tel el Yahuda, about 12 miles to the northeast of Cairo. There are probably 50 such mounds, none of which have been opened, in the Delta alone, and it is no exaggeration to say that there must be some hundreds between the Mediterranean and the first cataract. An inscription found of late years at Abydos shows that Rameses II reigned over his great kingdom for the space of 67 years. "It is thou," says Rameses IV, addressing himself to Osiris, "it is thou who wilt rejoice me with such length of reign as Rameses II, the great god, in his 67 years. It is thou who wilt give me the long duration of this great reign." If we only knew at what age Rameses II succeeded to the throne, we should, by help of this inscription, know also the age at which he died. No such record has, however, transpired, but a careful comparison of the length of time occupied by the various events of his reign, and above all the evidence of age afforded by the mummy of this great Pharaoh, discovered in 1886, show that he must have been very nearly, if not quite, a centenarian. "Thou madest designs while yet in the age of infancy," says the Stela of Dacca. "Thou wert a boy wearing the sidelock, and no monument was erected, and no order was given without thee. Thou wert a youth aged 10 years, and all the public works were in thy hands, laying their foundations." These lines, translated literally, cannot, however, be said to prove much. They certainly contain nothing to show that this youth of 10 was, at the time alluded to, sole king and ruler of Egypt. That he was titular king, in the hereditary sense, from his birth and during the lifetime of his father, is now quite certain. That he should, as a boy, have designed public buildings and superintended their construction, is extremely probable. The office was one which might well have been discharged by a crown prince who delighted in architecture, and made it his peculiar study. It was in fact a very noble office, an office which from the earliest days of the ancient empire had constantly been confided to princes of the royal blood, but it carried with it no evidence of sovereignty. The presumption therefore would be that the Stela of Dacca, dating as it does from the 3rd year of the sole reign of Rameses II, alludes to a time long since past, when the king as a boy held office under his father. The same inscription, as we have already seen, makes reference to the victorious campaign in the south. Rameses is addressed as the bull powerful against Ethiopia, the griffin furious against the negroes, and that the events hereby alluded to must have taken place during the first 3 years of his sole reign is proved by the date of the tablet. The great dedicatory inscription of Abydos shows, in fact, that Rameses II was prosecuting a campaign in Ethiopia at the time when he received intelligence of the death of his father, and that he came down the Nile northwards in order, probably, to be crowned at Thebes. Now the famous sculptures of the commemorative chapel at Beit el Weli relate expressly to the events of this expedition, and as they are executed in that refined and delicate style which especially characterizes the bas-relief work of Gurna, of Abydos, of all those buildings which were either erected by Seti I or begun by Seti and finished during the early years of Rameses II, I venture to think we may regard them as contemporary, or very nearly contemporary with the scenes they represent. In any case, it is reasonable to conclude that the artist employed on the work would know something about the events and persons delineated. And that they would be guilty of no glaring inaccuracies. All doubt as to whether the dates refer to the associated reigns of Seti and Rameses, or to the sole reign of the latter, vanish, however, when in these same sculptures we find the conqueror accompanied by his son, Prince Amenhotep, who is of an age not only to bear his part in the field, but afterwards to conduct an important ceremony of state on the occasion of the submission and tribute offering of the Ethiopian commander. Such is the unmistakable evidence of the bas-reliefs at Beit el Weli, as those who cannot go to Beit el Weli may see and judge for themselves by means of the admirable casts of these great tableaux which line the walls of the second Egyptian room at the British Museum. To explain away Prince Amenhotep would be difficult. We are accustomed to a certain amount of courtly exaggeration on the part of those who record with pen or pencil the great deeds of the pharaohs. We expect to see the king always young, always beautiful, always victorious. It seems only right and natural that he should never be less than 20, and sometimes more than 60 feet in height. But that any flatterer should go so far as to credit a lad of 13 with a son at least as old as himself is surely quite incredible. Lastly, there is the evidence of the Bible. Joseph being dead and the Israelites established in Egypt, there comes to the throne a Pharaoh who takes alarm at the increase of this alien race, and who seeks to check their too rapid multiplication. He not only oppresses the foreigners, but ordains that every male infant born to them in their bondage shall be cast into the river. This Pharaoh is now universally believed to be Rameses II. Then comes the old, sweet, familiar Bible story that we know so well. Moses is born, cast adrift in the ark of bulrushes, and rescued by the king's daughter. He becomes to her as a son. Although no dates are given, it is clear that the new Pharaoh has not been long upon the throne when these events happen. It is equally clear that he is no mere youth. He is old in the uses of statecraft, and he is the father of a princess of whom it is difficult to suppose that she herself was an infant. On the whole, then, we can but conclude that Rameses II, though born a king, was not merely grown to manhood, but wedded and the father of children already past the period of infancy, before he succeeded to the sole exercise of sovereign power. This is, at all events, the view taken by Professor Maspero, who expressly says, in the latest edition of his Histoire Ancienne, that Rameses II, when he received news of the death of his father, was then in the prime of life, and surrounded by a large family, some of whom were of an age to fight under his command. Bruges places the birth of Moses in the 6th year of the reign of Rameses II. This may very well be. The 80 years that elapsed between that time and the time of the Exodus correspond with sufficient exactness to the chronological data furnished by the monuments. Moses would thus see out the 61 remaining years of the king's long life, and release the Israelites from bondage towards the close of the reign of Meneptah, who sat for about 20 years on the throne of his fathers. The correspondence of dates this time leaves nothing to be desired. The Sesostris of Diodorus Siculus went blind, and died by his own hand, which act, says the historian, as it is conformed to the glory of his life, was greatly admired by his people. We are here evidently in the region of pure fable. Suicide was by no means an Egyptian but a classical virtue. Just as the Greeks hated age, the Egyptians reverenced it, and it may be doubted whether a people who seem always to have passionately desired length of days, would have seen anything to admire in a wilful shortening of that most precious gift of the gods. With the one exception of Cleopatra, the death of Nicotis the Rosy-cheeked being also of Greek, and therefore questionable origin, no Egyptian sovereign is known to have committed suicide, and even Cleopatra, who was half Greek by birth, must have been influenced to the act by Greek and Roman example. Dismissing, then, altogether this legend of blindness and self-slaughter, it must be admitted that of the death of Rameses II we know nothing certain. Such are, very briefly, the leading facts of the history of this famous Pharaoh. Exhaustively treated, they would expand into a volume. Even then, however, one would ask, and ask in vain, what manner of man he was. Every attempt to evolve his personal character from these scanty data is, in fact, a mere exercise of fancy. That he was personally valiant may be gathered, with due reservation, from the poem of Pentar, and that he was not unmerciful is shown in the extradition clause of the Khetun treaty. His pride was evidently boundless. Every temple which he erected was a monument to his own glory, every colossus was a trophy, every inscription a paean of self-praise. At Abu Simbel, at Dur, at Gurf Hussein, he seated his own image in the sanctuary among the images of the gods. There are even instances in which he is depicted under the twofold aspect of royalty and divinity, Rameses the Pharaoh burning incense before Rameses the deity. For the rest, it is safe to conclude that he was neither better nor worse than the general run of Oriental despots, that he was ruthless in war, prodigal in peace, rapacious of booty, and unsparing in the exercise of almost boundless power. Such pride and such despotism were, however, in strict accordance with immemorial precedent, and with the temper of the age in which he lived. The Egyptians would seem, beyond all doubt, to have believed that their king was always, in some sense, divine. They wrote hymns and offered up prayers to him, and regarded him as the living representative of deity. His princes and ministers habitually addressed him in the language of worship. Even his wives, who ought to have known better, are represented in the performance of acts of religious adoration before him. What wonder, then, if the man so deified believed himself a god? End of section 45. Miles Up the Nile, section 46. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 16. Abu Simbel, Part 1. We came to Abu Simbel on the night of the 31st of January, and we left at sunset on the 18th of February. Of these 18 clear days, we spent 14 at the foot of the rock of the great temple, called in the old Egyptian tongue the rock of Abshek. The remaining 4, taken at the end of the first week and the beginning of the second, were passed in the excursion to Wadi Halfa and back. By thus dividing the time, our long sojourn was made less monotonous for those who had no especial work to do. Meanwhile it was wonderful to wake every morning close under the steep bank, and, without lifting one's head from the pillow, to see that row of giant faces so close against the sky. They showed unearthly enough by moonlight, but not half so unearthly as in the grey of dawn. At that hour, the most solemn of the 24, they wore a fixed and fatal look that was little less than appalling. As the sky warmed, this awful look was succeeded by a flush that mounted and deepened like the rising flush of life. For a moment they seemed to glow, to smile, to be transfigured. Then came a flash, as of thought itself. It was the first instantaneous flash of the risen sun. It lasted less than a second. It was gone almost before one could say that it was there. The next moment, mountain, river, and sky were distinct in the steady light of day, and the colossi, mere colossi now, sat serene and stony in the open sunshine. Every morning I waked in time to witness that daily miracle. Every morning I saw those awful brethren pass from death to life, from life to sculptured stone. I brought myself almost to believe, at last, that there must sooner or later come some one sunrise when the ancient charm would snap asunder, and the giants must arise and speak. Stupendous as they are, nothing is more difficult than to see the colossi properly. Standing between the rock and the river, one is too near; stationed on the island opposite, one is too far off; while from the sand slope only a side view is obtainable. Hence, for want of a fitting standpoint, many travellers have seen nothing but deformity in the most perfect face handed down to us by Egyptian art. One recognizes in it the Negro, and one the Mongolian type, while another admires the fidelity with which the Nubian characteristics have been seized. Yet in truth the head of the young Augustus is not cast in a loftier mould. These statues are portraits of the same man 4 times repeated, and that man is Rameses the Great. Now Rameses the Great, if he was as much like his portraits as his portraits are like each other, must have been one of the handsomest men, not only of his day, but of all history. Wheresoever we meet with him, whether in the fallen Colossus at Memphis, or in the Syenite torso of the British Museum, or among the innumerable bas-reliefs of Thebes, Abydos, Gourna, and Bat el Weli, his features, though bearing in some instances the impress of youth and in others of maturity, are always the same. The face is oval, the eyes are long, prominent, and heavy-lidded, the nose is slightly aquiline and characteristically depressed at the tip, the nostrils are open and sensitive, the under lip projects, the chin is short and square. Here, for instance, is an outline from a bas-relief at Beit el Weli. The subject is commemorative of the king's first campaign. A beardless youth fired with the rage of battle, he clutches a captive by the hair and lifts his mace to slay. In this delicate and Dantesque face, which lacks as yet the fullness and repose of the later portraits, we recognize all the distinctive traits of the older Rameses. Here again is a sketch from Abydos, in which the king, although he has not yet ceased to wear the side-lock of youth, is seen with a boyish beard, and looks some 3 or 4 years older than in the previous portrait. It is interesting to compare these heads with the accompanying profile of one of the caryatid colossi inside the great temple of Abu Simbel, and all 3 with one of the giant portraits of the façade. This last, whether regarded as a marvel of size or of portraiture, is the chef d'oeuvre of Egyptian sculpture. We here see the great king in his prime. His features are identical with those of the head at Beit el Weli, but the contours are more amply filled in and the expression is altogether changed. The man is full 15 or 20 years older. He has outlived that rage of early youth. He is no longer impulsive, but implacable. A godlike serenity, an almost superhuman pride, an immutable will, breathe from the sculptured stone. He has learned to believe his prowess irresistible, and himself almost divine. If he now raised his arm to slay, it would be with the stern placidity of a destroying angel. The annexed woodcut gives the profile of the southernmost Colossus, which is the only perfect, or very near perfect, one of the 4. The original can be correctly seen from but one point of view, and that point is where the sand slope meets the northern buttress of the façade, at a level just parallel with the beards of the statues. It was thence that the present outline was taken. The sand slope is steep, and loose, and hot to the feet. More disagreeable climbing it would be hard to find even in Nubia, but no traveller who refuses to encounter this small hardship need believe that he has seen the faces of the Colossi. Viewed from below, this beautiful portrait is foreshortened out of all proportion. It looks unduly wide from ear to ear, while the lips and lower part of the nose show relatively larger than the rest of the features. The same may be said of the great cast in the British Museum. Cooped up at the end of a narrow corridor and lifted not more than 15 feet above the ground, it is carefully placed so as to be wrong from every point of view and shown to the greatest possible disadvantage. The artists who wrought the original statues were, however, embarrassed by no difficulties of focus, daunted by no difficulties of scale. Giants themselves, they summoned these giants from out of the solid rock, and endowed them with superhuman strength and beauty. They sought no quarried blocks of syenite or granite for their work. They fashioned no models of clay. They took a mountain, and fell upon it like Titans, and hollowed and carved it as though it were a cherry stone, and left it for the feebler men of after ages to marvel at forever. One great hall and 15 spacious chambers they hewed out from the heart of it, then smoothed the rugged precipice towards the river, and cut 4 huge statues with their faces to the sunrise, 2 to the right and 2 to the left of the doorway, there to keep watch to the end of time. These tremendous warders sit 66 feet high, without the platform under their feet. They measure across the chest 25 feet and 4 inches, from the shoulder to the elbow 15 feet and 6 inches, from the inner side of the elbow joint to the tip of the middle finger 15 feet, and so on in relative proportion. If they stood up, they would tower to a height of at least 83 feet, from the soles of their feet to the tops of their enormous double crowns. Nothing in Egyptian sculpture is perhaps quite so wonderful as the way in which these Abu Simbel artists dealt with the thousands of tons of material to which they here gave human form. Consummate masters of effect, they knew precisely what to do, and what to leave undone. These were portrait statues, therefore they finished the heads up to the highest point consistent with their size. But the trunk and the lower limbs they regarded from a decorative rather than a statuesque point of view. As a decoration, it was necessary that they should give size and dignity to the façade. Everything, consequently, was here subordinated to the general effect of breadth, of massiveness, of repose. Considered thus, the colossi are a triumph of treatment. Side by side they sit, placid and majestic, their feet a little apart, their hands resting on their knees. Shapely though they are, those huge legs look scarcely inferior in girth to the great columns of Karnak. The articulations of the knee joint, the swell of the calf, the outline of the peroneus longus are indicated rather than developed. The toenails and toe joints are given in the same bold and general way, but the fingers, because only the tips of them could be seen from below, are treated en bloc. Their faces show the same largeness of style. The little dimple which gives such sweetness to the corners of the mouth, and the tiny depression in the lobe of the ear are in fact circular cavities as large as saucers. How far this treatment is consistent with the most perfect delicacy and even finesse of execution may be gathered from the sketch. The nose there shown in profile is 3 feet and a half in length. The mouth, so delicately curved, is about the same in width. Even the sensitive nostril, which looks ready to expand with the breath of life, exceeds 8 inches in length. The ear, which is placed high and is well detached from the head, measures 3 feet and 5 inches from top to tip. A recent writer who brings sound practical knowledge to bear upon the subject is of opinion that the Egyptian sculptors did not even point their work beforehand. If so, then the marvel is only so much the greater. The men who, working in so coarse and friable a material, could not only give beauty and finish to heads of that size, but could with barbaric tools hew them out ab initio from the natural rock, were the Michelangelos of their age. It has already been said that the last Rameses to the southward is the best preserved. His left arm and hand are injured, and the head of the uraeus sculptured on the front of the pshent is gone. But with these exceptions the figure is whole, as fresh in surface, as sharp in detail, as on the day it was completed. The next is shattered to the waist. His head lies at his feet, half buried in sand. The third is nearly as perfect as the first, while the fourth has lost not only the whole beard and the greater part of the uraeus, but has both arms broken away, and a big cavernous hole in the front of the body. From the double crowns of the 2 last, the top ornament is also missing. It looks a mere knob, but it measures 8 feet in height. Such an effect does the size of these 4 figures produce on the mind of the spectator that he scarcely observes the fractures they have sustained. I do not remember to have even missed the head and body of the shattered one, though nothing is left of it above the knees. Those huge legs and feet covered with ancient inscriptions, some of Greek, some of Phoenician origin, tower so high above the heads of those who look at them from below, that one scarcely thinks of looking higher still. The figures are naked to the waist, and clothed in the usual striped tunic. On their heads they wear the double crown, and on their necks rich collars of cabochon drops cut in very low relief. The feet are bare of sandals, and the arms of bracelets, but in the front of the body, just where the customary belt and buckle would come, are deep holes in the stone, such as might have been made to receive rivets, supposing the belts to have been made of bronze or gold. On the breast, just below the necklace, and on the upper part of each arm, are cut in magnificent ovals, between 4 and 5 feet in length, the ordinary cartouches of the king. These were probably tattooed upon his person in the living flesh. Some have supposed that these statues were originally coloured, and that the colour may have been effaced by the ceaseless shifting and blowing of the sand. Yet the drift was probably at its highest when Burckhardt discovered the place in 1813, and on the two heads that were still above the surface he seems to have observed no traces of colour. Neither can the keenest eye detect any vestige of that delicate film of stucco with which the Egyptians invariably prepared their surfaces for painting. Perhaps the architects were for once content with the natural colour of the sandstone, which is here very rich and varied. It happens also that the colossi come in a light-coloured vein of the rock, and so sit relieved against a darker background. Towards noon, when the level of the façade has just passed into shade, and the sunlight still strikes upon the statues, the effect is quite startling. The whole thing, which is then best seen from the island, looks like a huge onyx cameo cut in high relief. A statue of Ra, to whom the temple is dedicated, stands some 20 feet high in a niche over the doorway, and is supported on either side by a bas-relief portrait of the king in an attitude of worship. Next above these comes a superb hieroglyphic inscription reaching across the whole front. Above the inscription a band of royal cartouches. Above the cartouches a frieze of sitting apes. Above the apes, last and highest, some fragments of a cornice. The height of the whole may have been somewhat over 100 feet. Wherever it has been possible to introduce them as decoration, we see the ovals of the king. Under those sculptured on the platforms and over the door, I observed the hieroglyphic character Nub, which in conjunction with the sign known as the determinative of metals signifies gold, Nub, but when represented as here without the determinative, stands for Nubia, the land of gold. This addition, which I do not remember to have seen elsewhere in connection with the cartouches of Rameses II, is here used in an heraldic sense, as signifying the sovereignty of Nubia. The relative position of the two temples of Abu Simbel has been already described, how they are excavated in two adjacent mountains and divided by a cataract of sand. The front of the small temple lies parallel to the course of the Nile, here flowing in a north-easterly direction. The façade of the great temple is cut in the flank of the mountain and faces due east. Thus the colossi, towering above the shoulder of the sand drift, catch, as it were, a side view of the small temple, and confront vessels coming up the river. As for the sand drift, it curiously resembles the glacier of the Rhone. In size, in shape, in position, in all but colour and substance, it is the same. Pent in between the rocks at the top, it opens out like a fan at the bottom. In this its inevitable course, it slants downward across the façade of the great temple. For ever descending, drifting, accumulating, it wages the old stealthy war, and, unhasting, unresting, labours grain by grain to fill the hollowed chambers, and bury the great statues, and wrap the whole temple in a winding sheet of golden sand, so that the place thereof shall know it no more. It had very nearly come to this when Burckhardt went up, A.D. 1813. The top of the doorway was then 30 feet below the surface. Whether the sand will ever reach that height again must depend on the energy with which it is combated. It can only be cleared as it accumulates. To avert it is impossible. Backed by the illimitable wastes of the Libyan desert, the supply from above is inexhaustible. Come it must, and come it will to the end of time. The drift rose to the lap of the northernmost colossus and half-way up the legs of the next when the Philae lay at Abu Simbel. The doorway was clear, however, almost to the threshold, and the sand inside was not more than 2 feet deep in the first hall. The whole façade, we were told, had been laid bare, and the interior swept and garnished, when the Empress of the French, after opening the Suez Canal in 1869, went up the Nile as far as the second cataract. By this time, most likely, that yellow carpet lies thick and soft in every chamber, and is fast silting up the doorway again. End of section 46. Miles up the Nile, section 47. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 16. Abu Simbel, Part 2. How well I remember the restless excitement of our first day at Abu Simbel! While the morning was yet cool, the painter and the writer wandered to and fro, comparing and selecting points of view, and superintending the pitching of their tents. The painter planted his on the very brink of the bank, face to face with the colossi and the open doorway. The writer perched some 40 feet higher on the pitch of the sand slope, so getting a side view of the facade and a peep of distance looking up the river. To fix the tent up there was no easy matter. It was only by sinking the tent pole in a hole filled with stones that it could be trusted to stand against the steady push of the north wind, which at this season is almost always blowing. Meanwhile the travellers from the other dahabiyas were tramping backwards and forwards between the two temples, filling the air with laughter and waking strange echoes in the hollow mountains. As the day wore on, however, they returned to their boats, which one by one spread their sails and bore away for Wadi Halfa. When they were fairly gone and we had the marvellous place all to ourselves, we went to see the temples. The smaller one, though it comes first in the order of sailing, is generally seen last, and seen therefore to disadvantage. To eyes fresh from the abode of Ra, the abode of Hathor looks less than its actual size, which is in fact but little inferior to that of the temple at Dur. A first hall, measuring some 40 feet in length by 21 in width, leads to a transverse corridor, 2 side chambers, and a sanctuary 7 feet square, at the upper end of which are the shattered remains of a cow-headed statue of Hathor. 6 square pillars, as at Dur, support what, for want of a better word, one must call the ceiling of the hall, though the ceiling is, in truth, the superincumbent mountain. In this arrangement, as in the general character of the bas-relief sculptures which cover the walls and pillars, there is much simplicity, much grace, but nothing particularly new. The façade, however, is a daring innovation. To those who have not seen the place the annexed illustration is worth pages of description, and to describe it in words only would be difficult. Here the whole front is but a frame for 6 recesses, from each of which a colossal statue, erect and lifelike, seems to be walking straight out from the heart of the mountain. These statues, 3 to the right and 3 to the left of the doorway, stand 30 feet high, and represent Rameses II and Nefertari, his queen. Mutilated as they are, the male figures are full of spirit, and the female figures full of grace. The queen wears on her head the plumes and disk of Hathor. The king is crowned with the shent, and with a fantastic helmet adorned with plumes and horns. They have their children with them, the queen her daughters, the king his sons, infants of 10 feet high, whose heads just reach to the parental knee. The walls of these 6 recesses, as they follow the slope of the mountain, form massive buttresses, the effect of which is wonderfully bold in light and shadow. The doorway gives the only instance of a porch that we saw in either Egypt or Nubia. The superb hieroglyphs which cover the faces of these buttresses, and the front of this porch, are cut half a foot deep into the rock, and are so large that they can be read from the island in the middle of the river. The tale they tell, a tale retold in many varied turns of old Egyptian style, upon the architraves within, is singular and interesting. Rameses, the strong in truth, the beloved of Amen, says the outer legend, made this divine abode for his royal wife, Nefertari, whom he loves. The legend within, after enumerating the titles of the king, records that his royal wife who loves him, Nefertari the beloved of Mot, constructed for him this abode in the mountain of the pure waters. On every pillar, in every act of worship pictured on the walls, even in the sanctuary, we find the names of Rameses and Nefertari coupled and inseparable. In this double dedication, and in the unwonted tenderness of the style, one seems to detect traces of some event, perhaps of some anniversary, the particulars of which are lost forever. It may have been a meeting, it may have been a parting, it may have been a prayer answered or a vow fulfilled. We see at all events that Rameses and Nefertari desired to leave behind them an imperishable record of the affection which united them on earth, and which they hoped would reunite them in Amenti. What more do we need to know? We see that the queen was fair, that the king was in his prime. We divine the rest, and the poetry of the place at all events is ours. Even in these barren solitudes there is wafted to us a breath from the shores of old romance. We feel that love once passed this way, and that the ground is still hallowed where he trod. We hurried on to the great temple without waiting to examine the lesser one in detail. A solemn twilight reigned in the first hall, beyond which all was dark. 8 colossi, 4 to the right and 4 to the left, stand ranged down the centre, bearing the mountain on their heads. Their height is 25 feet. With hands crossed on their breasts, they clasp the flail and crook, emblems of majesty and dominion. It is the attitude of Osiris, but the face is the face of Rameses II. Seen by this dim light, shadowy, mournful, majestic, they look as if they remembered the past. Beyond the first hall lies a second hall supported on 4 square pillars. Beyond this again a transverse chamber, the walls of which are covered with coloured bas-reliefs of various gods. Last of all, the sanctuary. Here, side by side, sit 4 figures larger than life: Ptah, Amun-Ra, Ra, and Rameses deified. Before them stands an altar, in shape a truncated pyramid, cut from the solid rock. Traces of colour yet linger on the garments of the statues, while in the walls on either side are holes and grooves such as might have been made to receive a screen of metalwork. The air in the sanctuary was heavy with an acrid smoke, as if the priests had been burning some strange incense and were only just gone. For this illusion we were indebted to the visitors who had been there before us. They had lit the place with magnesian wire, the vapour of which lingers long in these unventilated vaults. To settle down then and there to a steady investigation of the wall sculptures was impossible. We did not attempt it. Wandering from hall to hall, from chamber to chamber, now trusting to the faint gleams that straggled in from without, now stumbling along the light of a bunch of candles tied to the end of a stick, we preferred to receive those first impressions of vastness, of mystery, of gloomy magnificence, which are the more profound for being somewhat vague and general. Scenes of war, of triumph, of worship passed before our eyes like the incidents of a panorama. Here the king, borne along at full gallop by plumed steeds gorgeously caparisoned, draws his mighty bow and attacks a battlemented fortress. The besieged, some of whom are transfixed by his tremendous arrows, supplicate for mercy. They are a Syrian people, and are by some identified with the northern Hittites. Their skin is yellow, and they wear the long hair and beard, the fillet, the rich robe, fringed cape, and embroidered baldric with which we are now familiar in the Nineveh sculptures. A man driving off cattle in the foreground looks as if he had stepped out of one of the tablets in the British Museum. Rameses meanwhile towers, swift and godlike, above the crowd. His coursers are of such immortal strain as were the coursers of Achilles. His sons, his whole army, chariot and horse, follow headlong at his heels. All is movement and the splendour of battle. Farther on we see the king returning in state, preceded by his prisoners of war. Tied together in gangs, they stagger as they go, with heads thrown back and hands uplifted. These, however, are not Assyrians, but Abyssinians and Nubians, so true to the type, so thick-lipped, flat-nosed, and woolly-headed, that only the pathos of the expression saves them from being ludicrous. It is naturalness pushed to the verge of caricature. A little farther still, and we find Rameses leading a string of these captives into the presence of Amun-Ra, Mot, and Khonos. Amun-Ra weird and unearthly, with his blue complexion and towering plumes; Mot wearing the crown of Upper Egypt; Khonos by a subtle touch of flattery depicted with the features of the king. Again, to the right and left of the entrance, Rameses, thrice the size of life, slays a group of captives of various nations. To the left Amun-Ra, to the right Ra-Harmachis approve and accept the sacrifice. In the second hall we see, as usual, the procession of the sacred bark. Ptah, Khem, and Bast, gorgeous in many-coloured garments, gleam dimly like figures in faded tapestry from the walls of the transverse corridor. But the wonder of Abu Simbel is the huge subject on the north side of the great hall. This is a monster battle-piece which covers an area of 57 feet and 7 inches in length, by 25 feet 4 inches in height, and contains over 1,100 figures. Even the heraldic cornice of cartouches and asps which runs round the rest of the ceiling is omitted on this side, so that the wall is literally filled with the picture from top to bottom. Fully to describe this huge design would take many pages. It is a picture gallery in itself. It represents not a single action, but a whole campaign. It sets before us with Homeric simplicity the pomp and circumstance of war, the incidents of camp life, and the accidents of the open field. We see the enemy's city with its battlemented towers and triple moat, the besiegers' camp and the pavilion of the king, the march of infantry, the shock of chariots, the hand-to-hand melee, the flight of the vanquished, the triumph of Pharaoh, the bringing in of the prisoners, the counting of the hands of the slain. A great river winds through the picture from end to end, and almost surrounds the invested city. The king in his chariot pursues a crowd of fugitives along the bank. Some are crushed under his wheels, some plunge into the water and are drowned. Behind him a moving wall of shields and spears advances with rhythmic step to the serried phalanx, while yonder, where the fight is thickest, we see chariots overturned, men dead and dying, and riderless horses making for the open. Meanwhile the besieged send out mounted scouts, and the country folk drive their cattle to the hills. A grand frieze of chariots charging at full gallop divides the subject lengthwise, and separates the Egyptian camp from the field of battle. The camp is square, and enclosed, apparently, in a palisade of shields. It occupies less than 1/6 part of the picture, and contains about 100 figures. Within this narrow space the artist has brought together an astonishing variety of incidents. The horses feed in rows from a common manger, or wait their turn and impatiently paw the ground. Some are lying down. One, just unharnessed, scampers round the enclosure. Another, making off with the empty chariot at his heels, is intercepted by a couple of grooms. Other grooms bring buckets of water slung from the shoulders on wooden yokes. A wounded officer sits apart, his head resting on his hand, and an orderly comes in haste to bring him news of the battle. Another, hurt apparently in the foot, is having the wound dressed by a surgeon. 2 detachments of infantry, marching out to reinforce their comrades in action, are met at the entrance to the camp by the royal chariot returning from the field. Rameses drives before him some fugitives, who are trampled down, seized, and dispatched upon the spot. In one corner stands a row of objects that look like joints of meat, and near them are a small altar and a tripod brazier. Elsewhere, a couple of soldiers with a big bowl between them sit on their heels and dip their fingers in the mess, precisely as every fellah does to this day. Meanwhile, it is clear that Egyptian discipline was strict, and that the soldier who transgressed was as abjectly subject to the rule of stick as his modern descendant. In no less than 3 places do we see this time-honored institution in full operation, the superior officer energetically flourishing his staff, the private taking his punishment with characteristic disrelish. In the middle of the camp, watched over by his keeper, lies Rameses' tame lion, while close against the royal pavilion a hostile spy is surprised and stabbed by the officer on guard. The pavilion itself is very curious. It is evidently not a tent but a building, and was probably an extemporaneous construction of crude brick. It has 4 arched doorways, and contains in one corner an object like a cabinet, which has 2 sacred hawks for supporters. This object, which is in fact almost identical with the hieroglyphic emblem used to express a royal panegyric or festival, stands no doubt for the private oratory of the king. 5 figures kneel before it in adoration. To enumerate all or half the points of interest in this amazing picture would ask altogether too much space. Even to see it, with time at command and all the help that candles and magnesium torches can give, is far from easy. The relief is unusually low, and the surface, having originally been covered with stucco, is purposely roughened all over with tiny chisel marks, which painfully confuse the details. Nor is this all. Owing to some kind of saline ooze in that part of the rock, the stucco has not only peeled off, but the actual surface is injured. It seems to have been eaten away, just as iron is eaten by rust. A few patches adhere, however, in places and retain the original colouring. The river is still covered with blue and white zigzags, to represent water. Some of the fighting groups are yet perfect, and two very beautiful royal chariots, one of which is surmounted by a richly ornamented parasol canopy, are as fresh and brilliant as ever. The horses throughout are excellent. The chariot frieze is almost Panathenaic in its effect of multitudinous movement, while the horses in the camp of Rameses, for naturalness and variety of treatment, are perhaps the best that Egyptian art has to show. It is worth noting also that a horseman, that rara avis, occurs some 4 or 5 times in different parts of the picture. The scene of the campaign is laid in Syria. The river of blue and white zigzags is the Orontes, the city of the besieged is Kadesh or Cadiz, the enemy are the Kheta. The whole is, in fact, a grand picture epic of the events immortalized in the poem of Pentar, that poem which M. Derouget has described as a sort of Egyptian Iliad. The comparison would, however, apply to the picture with greater force than it applies to the poem. Pentar, who was in the first place a courtier and in the second place a poet, has sacrificed everything to the prominence of his central figure. He is intent upon the glorification of the king, and his poem, which is a mere paean of praise, begins and ends with the prowess of Rameses Mer Amen. If, then, it is to be called an Iliad, it is an Iliad from which everything that does not immediately concern Achilles is left out. The picture, on the contrary, though it shows the hero in combat and triumph, and always of colossal proportions, yet has space for a host of minor characters. The episodes in which these characters appear are essentially Homeric. The spy is surprised and slain as Dolon was slain by Ulysses. The men feast and fight and are wounded, just like the long-haired sons of Achaia, while their horses, loosed from the yoke, eat white barley and oats, hard by their chariots, waiting for the dawn. End of section 47. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 48. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 16. Abu Simbel, Part 3. Like Homer, too, the artist of the battle piece is careful to point out the distinguishing traits of the various combatants. The Kheta go 3 in a chariot, the Egyptians only 2. The Kheta wear a moustache and a scalp lock. The Egyptians pride themselves on a clean shave and cover their bare heads with ponderous wigs. The Sardinian contingent cultivate their own thick hair, whiskers, and mustachios, and their features are distinctly European. They also wear the curious helmet, surmounted by a ball and 2 spikes, by which they may always be recognized in the sculptures. These Sardinians appear only in the border frieze next to the floor. The sand had drifted up just at that point, and only the top of one fantastic helmet was visible above the surface. Not knowing in the least to what this might belong, we set the men to scrape away the sand, and so quite by accident uncovered the most curious and interesting group in the whole picture. The Sardinians, in Egyptian Shardana, seem to have been naturalized prisoners of war drafted into the ranks of the Egyptian army, and are the first European people whose name appears on the monuments. There is but 1 hour in the 24 at which it is possible to form any idea of the general effect of this vast subject, and that is at sunrise. Then only does the pure day stream in through the doorway and temper the gloom of the side aisles with light reflected from the sunlit floor. The broad divisions of the picture and the distribution of the masses may then be dimly seen. The details, however, require candlelight, and can only be studied a few inches at a time. Even so, it is difficult to make out the upper groups without the help of a ladder. Salome, mounted on a chair and provided with 2 long sticks lashed together, could barely hold his little torch high enough to enable the writer to copy the inscription on the middle tower of the fortress of Kadesh. It is fine to see the sunrise on the front of the great temple, but something still finer takes place on certain mornings of the year in the very heart of the mountain. As the sun comes up above the eastern hilltops, one long, level beam strikes through the doorway, pierces the inner darkness like an arrow, penetrates to the sanctuary, and falls like fire from heaven upon the altar at the feet of the gods. No one who has watched for the coming of that shaft of sunlight can doubt that it was a calculated effect, and that the excavation was directed at one especial angle in order to produce it. In this way Ra, to whom the temple was dedicated, may be said to have entered in daily, and by a direct manifestation of his presence to have approved the sacrifices of his worshippers. I need scarcely say that we did not see half the wall sculptures or even half the chambers that first afternoon at Abu Simbel. We rambled to and fro, lost in wonder, and content to wonder, like rustics at a fair. We had, however, ample time to come again and again, and learn it all by heart. The writer went in constantly, and at all hours, but most frequently at the end of the day's sketching, when the rest were walking or boating in the cool of the late afternoon. It is a wonderful place to be in alone, a place in which the very darkness and silence are old, and in which Time himself seems to have fallen asleep. Wandering to and fro among these sculptured halls, like a shade among shadows, one seems to have left the world behind, to have done with the teachings of the present, to belong one's self to the past. The very gods assert their ancient influence over those who question them in solitude. Seen in the fast deepening gloom of evening, they look instinct with supernatural life. There were times when I should scarcely have been surprised to hear them speak, to see them rise from their painted thrones and come down from the walls. There were times when I felt I believed in them. There was something so weird and awful about the place, and it became so much more weird and awful the farther one went in, that I rarely ventured beyond the first hall when quite alone. One afternoon, however, when it was a little earlier, and therefore a little lighter than usual, I went to the very end, and sat at the feet of the gods in the sanctuary. All at once, I cannot tell why, for my thoughts just then were far away, it flashed upon me that a whole mountain hung, ready, perhaps, to cave in above my head. Seized by a sudden panic, such as one feels in dreams, I tried to run, but my feet dragged, and the floor seemed to sink under them. I felt I could not have called for help, though it had been to save my life. It is unnecessary, perhaps, to say that the mountain did not cave in, and that I had my fright for nothing. It would have been a grand way of dying all the same, and a still grander way of being buried. My visits to the great temple were not always so dramatic. I sometimes took Salome, who smoked cigarettes when not on active duty, or held a candle while I sketched patterns of cornices, head-dresses of kings and gods, designs of necklaces and bracelets, heads of captives, and the like. Sometimes we explored the side chambers. Of these there are 8, pitch dark and excavated at all kinds of angles. 2 or 3 are surrounded by stone benches cut in the rock, and in one the hieroglyphic inscriptions are part cut, part sketched in black and left unfinished. As this temple is entirely the work of Rameses II, and betrays no sign of having been added to by any of his successors, these evidences of incompleteness would seem to show that the king died before the work was ended. I was always under the impression that there were secret places yet undiscovered in these dark chambers, and Salome and I were always looking for them. At Dendera, at Edfu, at Medinet Habu, at Philae, there have been found crypts in the thickness of the walls and recesses under the pavements, for the safe-keeping of treasure in time of danger. The rock-cut temples must also have had their hiding-places, and those would doubtless take the form of concealed cells in the walls or under the floors of the side chambers. To come out from these black holes into the twilight of the great hall and see the landscape set, as it were, in the ebon frame of the doorway, was alone worth the journey to Abu Simbel. The sun being at such times in the west, the river, the yellow sand island, the palms and tamarisks opposite, and the mountains of the eastern desert were all flooded with a glory of light and colour to which no pen or pencil could possibly do justice. Not even the mountains of Moab in Helmut Hunt's scapegoat were so warm with rose and gold. Thus our days passed at Abu Simbel, the workers working, the idlers idling, the strangers from the outer world now and then coming and going. The heat on shore was great, especially in the sketching tents, but the north breeze blew steadily every day from about an hour after sunrise till an hour before sunset, and on board the dahabeah it was always cool. The happy couple took advantage of this good wind to do a good deal of boating, and by judiciously timing their excursions, contrived to use the tail of the day's breeze for their trip out, and the strong arms of 4 good rowers to bring them back again. In this way they managed to see the little rock-cut temple of Pharaoh, which the rest of us unfortunately missed. On another occasion they paid a visit to a certain sheikh who lived at a village about 2 miles south of Abu Simbel. He was a great man as Nubian magnates go. His name was Hassan ebn Rashwan el-Kashif, and he was a grandson of that same old Hassan Kashif who was vice-regent of Nubia in the days of Burckhardt and Belzoni. He received our happy couple with distinguished hospitality, killed a sheep in their honour, and entertained them for more than 3 hours. The meal consisted of an endless succession of dishes, all of which, like that bugbear of our childhood, the hated air with variations, went on repeating the same theme under a multitude of disguises, and whether roast, boiled, stewed, or minced, served on skewers, smothered in rice, or drowned in sour milk, were always mouton au fond. We now despaired of ever seeing a crocodile, and but for a trail that our men discovered on the island opposite, we should almost have ceased to believe that there were crocodiles in Egypt. The marks were quite fresh when we went to look at them. The creature had been basking high and dry in the sun, and this was the point at which he had gone down again to the river. The damp sand at the water's edge had taken the mould of his huge fleshy paws, and even of the jointed armour of his tail, though this last impression was somewhat blurred by the final rush with which he had taken to the water. I doubt if Robinson Crusoe, when he saw the famous footprint on the shore, was more excited than we of the Philae at the sight of this genuine and undeniable trail. As for the idle man, he flew at once to arms and made ready for the fray. He caused a shallow grave to be dug for himself a few yards from the spot, then went and lay in it for hours together, morning after morning, under the full blaze of the sun, flat, patient, alert, with his gun ready cocked and a Pall Mall budget up his back. It was not his fault if he narrowly escaped sunstroke, and had his labour for his reward. That crocodile was too clever for him, and took good care never to come back. Our sailors, meanwhile, though well pleased with an occasional holiday, began to find Abu Simbel monotonous. As long as the Bagstones stayed, the 2 crews met every evening to smoke, and dance, and sing their quaint roundelays together. But when rumours came of the wonderful things already done this winter above Wady Halfa, rumours that represented the second cataract as a populous solitude of crocodiles, then our faithful consort slipped away one morning before sunrise, and the Philae was left companionless. Seeing that the men's time hung heavy on their hands, our painter conceived the idea of setting them to clean the face of the northernmost Colossus, still disfigured by the plaster left on it when the great cast was taken by Mr. Hay more than half a century before. This happy thought was promptly carried into effect. A scaffolding of spars and oars was at once improvised, and the men, delighted as children at play, were soon swarming all over the huge head, just as the carvers may have swarmed over it in the days when Rameses was king. All they had to do was to remove any small lumps that might yet adhere to the surface, and then tint the white patches with coffee. This they did with bits of sponge tied to the end of sticks, but Rais Hassan, as a mark of dignity, had one of the painter's old brushes, of which he was immensely proud. It took them 3 afternoons to complete the job, and we were all sorry when it came to an end. To see Rais Hassan artistically touching up a gigantic nose almost as long as himself, Riscali and the cook boy staggering to and fro with relays of coffee brewed thick and slab for the purpose, Salome perched cross-legged like some complacent imp on the towering rim of the great shent overhead, the rest chattering and skipping about the scaffolding like monkeys, was, I venture to say, a sight more comic than has ever been seen at Abu Simbel before or since. Rameses' appetite for coffee was prodigious. He consumed I know not how many gallons a day. Our cook stood aghast at the demand made upon his stores. Never before had he been called upon to provide for a guest whose mouth measured 3 feet and a half in width. Still, the result justified the expenditure. The coffee proved a capital match for the sandstone, and though it was not possible wholly to restore the uniformity of the original surface, we at least succeeded in obliterating those ghastly splotches, which for so many years have marred this beautiful face as with the unsightliness of leprosy. What with boating, fishing, lying in wait for crocodiles, cleaning the Colossus, and filling reams of thin letter paper to friends at home, we got through the first week quickly enough. The painter and the writer working hard, meanwhile, in their respective ways, the painter on his big canvas in front of the temple, the writer shifting her little tent as she listed. Now, although the most delightful occupation in life is undoubtedly sketching, it must be admitted that the sketcher at Abu Simbel works under difficulties. Foremost among these comes the difficulty of position. The great temple stands within about 25 yards of the brink of the bank, and the lesser temple within as many feet, so that to get far enough from one's subject is simply impossible. The present writer sketched the small temple from the deck of the dahabeah, there being no point of view obtainable on shore. Next comes the difficulty of colour. Everything, except the sky and the river, is yellow. Yellow, that is to say, with a difference, yellow ranging through every gradation of orange, maize, apricot, gold, and buff. The mountains are sandstone, the temples are sandstone, the sand slope is powdered sandstone from the sandstone desert. In all these objects the scale of colour is necessarily the same. Even the shadows, glowing with reflected light, give back tempered repetitions of the dominant hue. Hence it follows that he who strives, however humbly, to reproduce the facts of the scene before him is compelled, bon gré, mal gré, to execute what some young painters would nowadays call a symphony in yellow. Lastly, there are the minor inconveniences of sun, sand, wind, and flies. The whole place radiates heat, and seems almost to radiate light. The glare from above and the glare from below are alike intolerable. Dazzled, blinded, unable even to look at his subject without the aid of smoke-coloured glasses, the sketcher whose tent is pitched upon the sand slope over against the great temple enjoys a foretaste of cremation. When the wind blows from the north, which at this time of the year is almost always, the heat is perhaps less distressing, but the sand is maddening. It fills your hair, your eyes, your water bottles, silts up your colour box, dries into your skies, and reduces your Chinese white to a gritty paste the colour of salad dressing. As for the flies, they have a morbid appetite for water-colours. They follow your wet brush along the paper, leave their legs in the yellow ochre, and plunge with avidity into every little pool of cobalt as it is mixed ready for use. Nothing disagrees with them, nothing poisons them, not even olive green. It was a delightful time, however, delightful alike for those who worked and those who rested, and these small troubles counted for nothing in the scale. Yet it was pleasant, all the same, to break away for a day or two, and be off for Wadi Halfa. End of section 48. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 49. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 17. The Second Cataract. Part 1. A fresh breeze, a full sail, and the consciousness of a holiday well earned carried us gaily along from Abu Simbel to Wadi Halfa. We started late in the afternoon of the first day, made about 12 miles before the wind dropped, and achieved the remaining 28 miles before noon the next day. It was our last trip on the Nile under canvas. At Wadi Halfa the Philae was doomed to be dismantled. The big sail that had so long been our pride and delight would there be taken down, and our good boat, her grace and swiftness gone at one fell swoop, would become a mere lumbering barge, more suggestive of civic outings on the Thames than of Cleopatra's galley. For some way beyond Abu Simbel the western bank is fringed by a long line of volcanic mountains, as much alike in height, size, and shape as a row of Martello towers. They are divided from one another by a series of perfectly uniform sand drifts, while on the rounded top of each mountain, thick as the currants on the top of a certain cake known to schoolboys by the endearing name of black caps, lies a layer of the oddest black stones in the world. Having more than once been to the top of the rock of Abshek, which is the first large mountain of the chain, and strewn in the same way, we recognized the stones, and knew what they were like. In colour they are purplish black, tinged here and there with dull red. They ring like clinkstone when struck, and in shape are most fantastic. L. picked up some like petrified bunches of grapes. Others are twisted and writhen like the Vesuvian lava of 1871. They lie loose upon the surface, and are of all sizes, some being as small as currants, and others as large as quartern loaves. Speaking as one having no kind of authority, I should say that these stones are unquestionably of fiery parentage. One seems to see how, boiling and bubbling in a state of fusion, they must have been suddenly checked by contact with some cooler medium. Where the chain ends, about 3 or 4 miles above Abu Simbel, the view widens, and a host of outlying mountains are seen scattered over an immense plain reaching for miles into the western desert. On the eastern bank, Kalat Ada, a huge, rambling Roman citadel going to solitary ruin on the last water-washed precipice to the left, brings the opposite range to a like end, and abuts on a similar plain, also scattered over with detached peaks. The scene here is desolately magnificent. A large island covered with palms divides the Nile in 2 branches, each of which looks as wide as the whole river. An unbounded distance opens away to the silvery horizon. On the banks there is no verdure, neither is there any sign of human toil. Nothing lives, nothing moves, save the wind and the river. Of all the strange peaks we have yet seen, the mountains hereabout are the strangest. Alone or in groups, they start up here and there from the deserts on both sides, like the pieces on a chessboard. They are, for the most part, conical, but they are not extinct craters, such as are the volcanic cones of Korosko and Dacca. Seeing how they all rose to about the same height, and were alike capped with that mysterious couche of shining black stones, the writer could not help fancying that, like the isolated Rocher de Cornuaille and Rocher de Saint Michel at Puy, they might be but fragments of a rocky crust, rent and swept away at some indefinitely remote period of the world's history, and that the level of their present summits might represent perhaps the ancient level of the plain. As regards form, they are weird enough for the wildest geological theories. All taper more or less towards the top. One is 4-sided like a pyramid, another, in shape like a truncated cone, looks as if crowned with a pagoda summer-house. A third seems to be surrounded by a mosque and cupola, a fourth is scooped out in tiers of arches, a fifth is crowned apparently with a cairn of piled stones, and so on with variations as endless as they are fantastic. A geologist might perhaps account for these caprices by showing how fire and earthquake and deluge had here succeeded each other, and how, after being first covered with volcanic stones and then split into chasms, the valleys thus opened had, by and by, been traversed by torrents, which wore away the softer parts of the rock and left the harder standing. Some way beyond Kalat Ada, when the Abu Simbel range and the Palm Island have all but vanished in the distance, and the lonely peak, called the Mountain of the Sun, Gebel es Shems, has been left far behind, we come upon a new wonder, namely, upon 2 groups of scattered tumuli, one on the eastern, one on the western bank. Not volcanic forms these, not even accidental forms, if one may venture to form an opinion from so far off. They are of various size, some little, some big, all perfectly round and smooth, and covered with a rich greenish-brown alluvial soil. How did they come here? Who made them? What did they contain? The Roman ruin close by, the 240,000 deserters who must have passed this way, the Egyptian and Ethiopian armies that certainly poured their thousands along these very banks, and might have fought many a battle on this open plain, suggest all kinds of possibilities, and fill one's head with visions of buried arms, and jewels, and cinerary urns. We are more than half minded to stop the boat and land that very moment, but are content on second thoughts with promising ourselves that we will at least excavate one of the smaller hillocks on our way back. And now, the breeze freshening and the dahabeah tearing gallantly along, we leave the tumuli behind and enter upon a still more desolate region, where the mountains recede farther than ever and the course of the river is interrupted by perpetual sandbanks. On one of these sandbanks, just a few yards above the edge of the water, lay a log of driftwood, apparently a battered old palm trunk, with some remnants of broken branches yet clinging to it, such an object, in short, as my American friends would very properly call a snag. Our pilot leaned forward on the tiller, put his finger to his lip, and whispered, "Crocodilo." The painter, the idle man, the writer, were all on deck, and not one believed him. They had seen too many of these snags already, and were not going to let themselves again be excited about nothing. The pilot pointed to the cabin where L. and the little lady were indulging in that minor vice called afternoon tea. "Sitte," said he. "Call Sitte. Crocodilo." We examined the object through our glasses. We laughed the pilot to scorn. It was the worst imitation of a crocodile that we had yet seen. All at once the palm trunk lifted up its head, cocked its tail, found its legs, set off running, wriggling, undulating down the slope with incredible rapidity, and was gone before we could utter an exclamation. We three had a bad time when the other two came up and found that we had seen our first crocodile without them. A sandbank which we passed next morning was scored all over with fresh trails, and looked as if it had been the scene of a crocodile parliament. There must have been at least 20 or 30 members present at the sitting, and the freshness of the marks showed that they had only just dispersed. A keen and cutting wind carried us along the last 30 miles of our journey. We had supposed that the farther south we penetrated, the hotter we should find the climate. Yet now, strange to say, we were shivering in sealskins, under the most brilliant sky in the world, and in a latitude more southerly than that of Mecca or Calcutta. It was some compensation, however, to run at full speed past the dullest of Nile scenery, seeing only sandbanks in the river, sand hills and sand flats on either hand, a disused shadoof or a skeleton boat rotting at the water's edge, a wind-tormented dome palm struggling for existence on the brink of the bank. End of section 49. Miles Up the Nile, section 50. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 17. The Second Cataract, Part 2. At a fatal corner about 6 miles below Wadi Halfa we passed a melancholy flotilla of dismantled dahabeahs. The Fostet, the Zenobia, the Alice, the Mansura, all alike weather-bound and laid up helplessly against the wind. The Mansura, with Captain and Mrs. E. on board, had been 3 days doing these 6 miles, at which rate of progress they might reasonably hope to reach Cairo in about a year and a month. The palms of Wadi Halfa, blue with distance, came into sight at the next bend, and by noon the Philae was once more moored alongside the Bagstones under a shore crowded with cangias, covered with bales and packing cases, and, like the shores of Mahada and Aswan, populous with temporary huts. For here it is that traders going by water embark and disembark on their way to and fro Dongola and the First Cataract. There were 3 temples, or at all events 3 ancient Egyptian buildings, once upon a time on the western bank over against Wadi Halfa. Now there are a few broken pillars, a solitary fragment of brick pylon, some remains of a flight of stone steps leading down to the river, and a wall of enclosure overgrown with wild pumpkins. These ruins, together with a rambling native khan and a noble old sycamore, form a picturesque group backed by amber sand cliffs, and mark the site of a lost city belonging to the early days of Usertesen III. The second, or Great Cataract, begins a little way above Wadi Halfa, and extends over a distance of many miles. It consists, like the First Cataract, of a succession of rocks and rapids, and is skirted for the first 5 miles or so by the sand cliff ridge which, as I have said, forms a background to the ruins just opposite Wadi Halfa. This ridge terminates abruptly in the famous precipice known as the Rock of Abu Simbel. Only adventurous travellers bound for Dongola or Khartoum go beyond this point, and they for the most part take the shorter route across the desert from Korosko. L. and the writer would fain have hired camels and pushed on as far as Semneh, which is a matter of only 2 days' journey from Wady Halfa, and for people provided with sketching tents is one of the easiest of inland excursions. One may go to the rock of Abu Sir by land or by water. The happy couple and the writer took 2 native boatmen versed in the intricacies of the cataract, and went in the felucca. L. and the painter preferred donkeying. Given a good breeze from the right quarter, there is, as regards time, but little to choose between the 2 routes. No one, however, who has approached the rock of Abu Sir by water, and seen it rise like a cathedral front from the midst of that labyrinth of rocky islets, some like clusters of basaltic columns, some crowned with crumbling ruins, some bleak and bare, some green with wild pomegranate trees, can doubt which is the more picturesque. Landing among the tamarisks at the foot of the cliff, we come to the spreading skirts of a sand drift steeper and more fatiguing to climb than the sand drift at Abu Simbel. We do climb it, however, though somewhat sulkily, and finding the donkey party perched upon the top, are comforted with draughts of ice-cold lemonade brought in a kulla from Wady Halfa. The summit of the rock is a mere ridge, steep and overhanging towards east and south, and carved all over with autographs in stone. Some few of these are interesting, but for the most part they record only the visits of the illustrious obscure. We found Belzoni's name, but looked in vain for the signatures of Burckhardt, Champollion, Lepsius, and Ampère. Owing to the nature of the ground and the singular clearness of the atmosphere, the view from this point seemed to me to be the most extensive I had ever looked upon. Yet the height of the rock of Abu Sir is comparatively insignificant. It would count but as a molehill if measured against some alpine summits of my acquaintance. I doubt whether it is as lofty as even the Great Pyramid. It is, however, a giddy place to look down from, and seems higher than it is. It is hard, now that we are actually here, to realize that this is the end of our journey. The cataract, an immense multitude of black and shining islets, among which the river, divided into hundreds of separate channels, spreads far and wide for a distance, it is said, of more than 16 miles, foams at our feet. Foams and frets and falls, gushing smooth and strong where its course is free, murmuring hoarsely where it is interrupted, now hurrying, now loitering, here eddying in oily circles, there lying in still pools unbroken by a ripple, everywhere full of life, full of voices, everywhere shining to the sun. Northwards, where it winds away towards Abu Simbel, we see all the fantastic mountains of yesterday on the horizon. To the east, still bounded by outliers of the same disconnected chain, lies a rolling waste of dark and stony wilderness, trenched with innumerable valleys through which flow streams of sand. On the western side the continuity of the view is interrupted by the ridge which ends with Abu Sir. Southwards the Libyan desert reaches away in one vast undulating plain, tawny, arid, monotonous, all sun, all sand, lit here and there with arrowy flashes of the Nile. Farthest of all, pale but distinct, on the outermost rim of the world, rise 2 mountain summits, one long, one dome-like. Our Nubians tell us that these are the mountains of Dongola. Comparing our position with that of the third cataract, as it appears upon the map, we come to the conclusion that these ghost-like silhouettes are the summits of Mount Fogo and Mount Arambo, 2 apparently parallel mountains situate on opposite sides of the river about 10 miles below Hannek, and consequently about 145 miles as the bird flies from the spot on which we are standing. In all this extraordinary panorama, so wild, so weird, so desolate, there is nothing really beautiful except the colour. But the colour is transcendent. Never, even in Egypt, have I seen anything so tender, so transparent, so harmonious. I shut my eyes, and it all comes before me. I see the amber of the sands, the pink and pearly mountains, the cataract rocks, all black and purple and polished, the dull grey palms that cluster here and there upon the larger islands, the vivid verdure of the tamarisks and pomegranates, the Nile a greenish brown flecked with yeasty foam, Over all the blue and burning sky, permeated with light and palpitating with sunshine. I made no sketch. I felt that it would be ludicrous to attempt it. And now I feel that any endeavour to put the scene into words is a mere presumptuous effort to describe the indescribable. Words are useful instruments, but, like the etching needle and the burin, they stop short at form. They cannot translate colour. If a traveller pressed for time asked me whether he should or should not go as far as the second cataract, I think I should recommend him to turn back from Abu Simbel. The trip must cost 4 days, and if the wind should happen to be unfavourable either way, it may cost 6 or 7. The 40 miles of river that have to be twice traversed are the dullest on the Nile. The cataract is but an enlarged and barren edition of the cataract between Aswan and Philae, and the Great View, as I have said, has not that kind of beauty which attracts the general tourist. It has an interest, however, beyond and apart from that of beauty. It rouses one's imagination to a sense of the greatness of the Nile. We look across a world of desert, and see the river still coming from afar. We have reached a point at which all that is habitable and familiar comes abruptly to an end. Not a village, not a bean field, not a shadoof, not a sakia is to be seen in the plain below. There is no sail on those dangerous waters. There is no moving creature on those pathless sands. But for the telegraphic wires stalking ghost-like across the desert, it would seem as if we had touched the limit of civilization, and were standing on the threshold of a land unexplored. Yet for all this we feel as if we were at only the beginning of the mighty river. We have journeyed well nigh 1,000 miles against the stream, but what is that to the distance which still lies between us and the Great Lakes? And how far beyond the Great Lakes must we seek for the source that is even yet undiscovered? End of section 50.